Hello, hello, and welcome to another podcast episode of Overpowering Emotions, where I talk all things big emotions, emotion regulation, anxiety, resilience, helping our kiddos be successful. And really, all of these strategies work for us adults as well. Very excited today talking with Brice Willis. He's actually someone that I went to grad school with many years ago. He's a registered psychologist in Alberta whose areas of expertise include general anxiety, coping with stress, mental toughness, and enhancing sports, school, and work performance. He has participated in several different sports and his competition experience at the local, provincial, national, and international levels. His experience has provided him with insight into the psychological, emotional, and physical demands that athletes face, as well as what is required for effective performance. And today we'll be talking about managing anxiety from sort of that performance lens. And really, when we look at things, performance anxiety is one of our biggest anxieties. It falls under the umbrella of social anxiety, right? And that's the number one area of challenge that we experience as a species, as a human being species, right? We want to belong to part of a tribe. And a big piece of that is how we perform and how we show up in that sort of way. So we do have a sports lens focus for today, but it's applicable in all areas of life. I hope you enjoy. So, Brice, thanks for joining me on the show today. It's exciting having you here.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's good to see you.
Yeah, 20 years later, it's been a long time. Brice and I go way back in grad school, not quite 20 years. I shouldn't probably age us, but it's been a while.
At least 15, I think it's getting there, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we start? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I work as a psychologist here in Calgary, and I have a bit of a split practice. So on one hand, I work with, adults and adolescents in a range of areas for counseling. I do kind of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, substance use disorders. But I also, on the other hand, have a fair bit of my population where I work with athletes and other performers. I like to work with them to help them improve their performance in their sport or activity, but also their enjoyment of it in that area as well.
I've been seeing a lot more of the sports psychology piece. Just my own girls are in pretty competitive sports, and just seeing, I've been doing a little bit more on mindset just because my focus is always anxiety, but some of that piece is just with some of the athletes that I get to work with. So I think it's really interesting. We were talking about viewing anxiety from that performance-based perspective. So maybe we can jump in there if you're willing to go there.
Yeah. And I think, sometimes we're talking about the same type of goal from different lenses, right? So as an example, you might have a youth or adolescent who's working on a test, and you could say, hey, part of the challenge here is they're feeling really anxious, and so let's target that anxiety that they feel. Similar approach, but different lens would be, let's look at this from a performance perspective. What's important about performing at our best? What are some of the different factors that can lead to it? And certainly anxiety might be a piece of it, but a somewhat bit of a different orientation than kind of targeting the specific area of anxiety or the challenge there.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that in different domains too, right? Outside the academics.
Yeah. So maybe it would be helpful. And I always talk about taking a transdiagnostic approach. And so when I'm looking at anxiety, it could be about phobias, scared of dogs, scared of needles. It could be more generalized, or scared of everything. But it doesn't really matter, right? It's looking at the patterns, the strengths, the challenges, kind of looking at all of those pieces. So how would you work with a kiddo, let's say that they have some of that performance anxiety, whether it's tests or, we can see it show up in even just putting our hand up in class, for example, right? So many different areas.
Yeah, lots of different areas, right? Where we actually look at it and its performance when we get down to a degree. So again, it would depend on the youth and obviously the situation, but certainly one lens that, starts to look at when they are able to perform and when they're able to perform at their very best and enjoy things the most and access all their strengths and abilities. What is that state, right? So one kind of perspective is something called optimal performance state, where it describes that focus we have, how we're viewing, where our attention is, what we're looking at in terms of ourself or the demands we're facing, what our physical state is, what our emotional state is, and starting to piece together a little bit about what that looks like for each person, as well as each activity, right? Because we think that might vary depending on what we're doing. Powerlifting would not be the same as it would be for taking a test or doing a presentation. And one person's disposition might not be the same as someone else's. But if we can start to figure out for each of those kind of unique individuals how they perform at their best in that state, that's often a bit of a first step.
I love that sort of strengths-based approach, because it's so easy just to look at the problem and stay stuck in deficit. And, I think can be so much harder looking at where we need to go, forgetting about what we're already doing successfully. So, and how would you go about that? How would you, help for people who are listening? I mean, there's other professionals who might be interested, but parents as well. You're starting to look for some of those strengths when kiddos in those areas of life, or adults too. This is applicable for everyone. How we can start really capitalizing and focusing with a little bit more awareness on those areas where we are performing well.
Yeah. So I think it would start with what you're talking about, right? Is that awareness. Mm-hmm. So we're really kind of digging for, and it is definitely consistent with some of the solution focused approaches too, right? We're digging for those times when I did perform well, right? Or I was in that state where, I was able to focus, attend, direct energy, be there. It does overlap a little bit sometimes with that flow concept, right? Or some of those clutch concepts, and really starting to gather some of that data.
Right.
Sometimes we'll have people kind of go back in time to identify some of those situations or notice them moving forward, but we're looking for all those different areas around what they were thinking about themselves, the challenge, how they're feeling physically, emotionally. Sometimes it's a combination of emotions too. Right. Definitely anxiety is often a really common component because it's almost always there to some degree in some of the performance situations. So we want to have them kind of dig into how it was showing up in the intensity, but also those other pieces.
Mm-hmm. I'm often giving homework about just our brain isn't set up to remember our successes. It's definitely more set up to remember our fails and hurts and, all of those things. So I'm often giving a homework to look for, start with 50 accomplishments that you've had from the time you were in preschool, as far back as you can remember, just to bring some of that awareness piece. And then daily, once we kind of catch up to now, sort of having daily awareness around those little things too, that can really add up. One thing, man, I always go in about a million different directions. So if you don't want to go in a direction that I'm going to take you in, or if you think there's an area that you think is more important, let me know. But one thing that I see that really sort of cripples any work that I do is if perfectionism is in the way. And I would say, even above depression or anything else that I work with, but especially when it comes to anxiety and performance anxiety, that perfectionism is almost the number one thing we need to focus on. I don't know if you find that in your own work and how you address that.
Yeah, certainly it's a piece, right? And I think it does relate to some of those appraisals that as performers we make all the time, but particularly around the consequences of success. So a lot of the models kind of look at, how am I especially automatically kind of viewing the nature of the challenge or threat itself? How am I viewing my strengths and resources for kind of meeting that? But the third piece that's also really big is the consequences. So that's where I do see some of that perfectionist and types of appraisals, again, that are usually automatic, right? If I am not successful, then it is, often bad or terrible, or it means something about me. And those perfectionist themes show up there. So that's definitely a piece that we look for, particularly on that cognitive side and how we want to be viewing the consequences in the situation.
And how would you address that?
So it depends, I think, too, a little bit on how sticky it is, but certainly there's kind of traditional cognitive kind of restructuring, reframing approaches or affirmations we use a lot in kind of sports psych, where we're just kind of specific intentional labels on that. Mm-hmm. So that might be a deliberate interpretation of, this is one of many tournaments, right? Or some of the growth mindset stuff often comes a little bit here, right? With some of the, how can I view this as a bit of a process that's distinct from me, which kind of takes some of that pressure off to have it to be perfect.
Right.
Sometimes it's even some kind of diffusion strategies where we're kind of just noticing those thoughts and kind of unhooking a little bit from them.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times I'm a bit on the behavioral side, right? So a lot of times it comes down to behaving in a way that's showing my body that things don't have to be perfect.
Right.
Sometimes it means making mistakes or having it not be perfect. You find that kind of sinks in a little bit the most, but
I definitely take a behavioral approach too, and then being able to tolerate. And that's really what it is. It's about tolerating the discomfort that comes with making a mistake.
yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, I do a lot of work around that piece. So, with the awareness, that's kind of the first step. We have the awareness of the strengths where I have been able to perform well. Then, where do you go with that?
Well, then we look to build that skill and capacity to get into that state or get closer to that state more often. So I do think it's really important to have that as a target, right? Because that puts us in a different both mindset, in my opinion, physiological process when we're saying, hey, I'm going to move towards this state versus, oh no, there's anxiety. I need to reduce that, which is more of a threat-oriented state.
Right.
So certainly we want to equip people with different psychological skills to move towards that. And there's a lot of commonality with some of the CBT kind of approaches. So it is working with building specific thinking patterns and prompts. Sometimes we'll have people explicitly identify those strengths and resources they have to meet some of those challenges, right? That can help our body when it's looking at that situation to remember that and see, yeah, you know what, even if this is a fairly significant challenge or a threat, and even if there is some high consequences to it, I do have a lot of these resources. So we're kind of priming that in the mind, and we're having them be able to identify and focus and hopefully learn from their experiences that that's accurate stuff.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's around kind of nervous system, physical, emotional kind of regulation. Some of the traditional things like breathing strategies, both for lowering or sometimes actually energizing or increasing, depending on what that state and that level might be. Sometimes it's imagery, which is a really common one. So we use imagery to help with kind of actual performance of skills and tactics and strategies, but we also use it for emotion regulation as a piece. It can help us move towards that zone. We have strategies around kind of attention regulation and practicing that, so that the attention is focused on kind of the task and what we want it to be versus the internal focus and threat-based focus, which can sometimes get hijacked by that anxiety process or by other demands in the situation. So those are some of the common ones. There's also some different biofeedback types of ones that are used at times.
Okay.
But all those are kind of put together in a package to help move towards that state, right?
Right. So I wonder if it might be helpful to use an example. But after that, once you do some of those kinds of things, would there be a next piece?
Reps.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Repetition.
So that's the kind of athlete in me, and that's what I believe kind of works, right? Same as any other skill in our sport or musical endeavor or anything else where we're performing. We want the reps, and we want the skill built in advance, right? We don't want to just have someone learn something and then go into the hardest possible situation and try and apply it. Mm-hmm. We want that capacity built, and then we want them repping that mental routine that includes those components over and over again. And often we'll have them associated with the practice and preparation components, so that many of those automatic processes start to kind of just kick in when they're in the actual performance situation.
Right. So having that daily piece, I remember reading somewhere and it was brilliant. So it was research just looking at English learner language kiddos who, to become fully fluent, needed to be fully immersed full time in an English speaking world, 5 to 7 years on average is what it took. Yeah. And to sort of be able to master all the discomfort that comes with anxiety and to tolerate everything that life throws us. And, all of those big situations when big emotions come up, it's kind of the same thing, being immersed every day. So it takes time. I think that's the point here, is that it takes time. You don't get a 6-pack abs overnight. Similarly, you have to do those reps, and it's sort of the whole package. You can't eat a pizza and bag of Oreos every day for dinner and even though you're doing sit-ups every day, right? Like there's a whole sort of approach that you need to take that takes time.
Yeah. And I think that's the ideal situation, really. And unfortunately, one of the most common challenges I face is athletes or performers coming kind of mid-season or before playoffs, right at the end, and the performance situation that's really big to them is coming up in a couple of weeks.
Right.
And what we ideally like is really during the off season to be building these skills and using them in practice and preparation so that they're really entrenched there. It's not to say we can't still contribute or help, especially with elements, but like you said, we want that immersion and that practice and that activation over and over.
Yeah. So if we were to take an example, and let me know if this isn't a great example, but let's say we've got a teenager, we'll say grade 12, right? Ready to write diplomas, right? But huge test anxiety, does great on assignments. I see this quite often where it does great on assignments, knows the materials, and then goes into a test and just bombs. And a lot of it is because of the test anxiety. How would you work with that student?
Yeah. And I see that actually commonly too, right? And they kind of blank, or they know it, or they can do it on an assignment after, and it's incredibly frustrating for them as well as for their family, for their teachers, right? And sometimes there's even that unfortunate implication that they're not doing enough, or not trying harder, which sometimes can worsen things, right? But yeah, so a lot of times it does start with some of the education on the process that can happen, right? I'm not sure from your lens and your models, but for us, what we think a lot of times happens is that anxiety shows up and the focus goes from kind of out of the present moment, what they need to be doing to perform, to like an inner focused and outcome focus, right? So I'm starting to think about what happens if I don't do well. Maybe I'm having memories of a previous test where this didn't go, my activation's up, my focus goes inwards instead of outwards on the task. So I actually can't think and process, as well as my nervous system will be higher. And now I notice it's getting harder to remember, which creates more distress. So we often kind of educate about some of that kind of cycle and that process that can happen. And it would be, in previous tests, or sometimes it's even practice tests, or sometimes it's even some of the assignments they do at home, but we start to identify, how were you feeling in those circumstances? What were the different types of emotions you're having, right? How intense were they? And then we might also look at how are you viewing the situation? A lot of times they're viewing it in a different way, right? It's okay if this isn't perfect. I know I can, get some help if I need to, or redo it, or other types of processes that basically remind themselves that it's okay. But we do want to dig into how they're viewing themselves in that situation around the test, the consequences of the test. I would, like I said before, really kind of have them identify some of those strengths and those abilities and resources that they know will help them to meet some of the demands of the specific situation. But then we would also have them look at what some of the most important things were to focus on in that test. Because there's definitely some strategic elements too. When we're going into tests, maybe there's strategies around how you read the question, what you focus on first, which helps us both tactically to identify what's a good approach, but also helps to direct our attention to what's most important, which is that being present in the moment versus that internal stuff, right?
Right.
And then sometimes it might be, let's work on some momentary muscle relaxation. Let's work on a little bit of kind of some of the diaphragmatic breathing, or downgrading a little bit of that activation if indeed it's often too high because of the anxiety. Maybe we'll work on some of the imagery around having them see and feel themselves performing well in that situation, especially if they can anchor to previous times when they have. It does take some digging, but a lot of times there are those foundations there that we can use.
Right.
And so we would, maybe put together a routine and we'd have them practice it, especially when they're doing their preparation and studying for it.
Okay.
And then that's all primed to go when they start to get in a test or performance situation.
Right. And what would be an example routine? Would it be then that step, like, so deep breathing, and then I'm going to visualize, and then is that what you mean by this is sort of your process for tests?
So I often will kind of anchor with a couple of the breaths, right? It's a bit of a cue, it's a bit of a down regulation, especially if that nervous system is tending to be a little bit higher. So we'll do kind of 2 or 3 breaths. We'll have them kind of remember what that state is where they perform at their best, right? Just a bit of a direction, So I'm calm, kind of moderate anxiety, I'm confident, feeling kind of excited, hopeful, and then some of the statements about themselves, right? I'm well prepared. I know this material well. I've demonstrated I can do this. I have options too if things aren't ideal. Some of those statements would be kind of what we're internally repping, and a little bit of that visualization of them executing the test, right?
Right.
And with visualization, we use lots of senses, right? Whether we see, hear, smell, feel as we're going into the room, right?
Right.
And especially if they've written the test in that room before, that's even better. They have that memory foundation. So they're kind of seeing themselves execute that, focusing on that technical, what's most important here? Okay, read the question thoroughly first, identify key elements, start with what I know, right? So having them kind of, again, internally represent that, and then a couple other kind of breaths to reground. And that would be an example of a routine, right?
Yeah, that's good. And it kind of reminds me of just when, athletes choke, for example, a couple of things. One, the visualization is kind of getting into, you're actually thinking of something that is impossible to fail on. And that's kind of what you're focusing on. So in golf, like we hear stories of these amazing golfers who are winning the Masters, and then, their last couple of strokes, they just bomb, and, like a 5-foot putt, and they're missing it. And so a visualization of something that absolutely cannot go wrong would be them picking up the ball from the hole, right? Like and so that's kind of what they're focusing on versus them trying to get the ball in, right? Because, and maybe I'll ask you about choking in a second, but focusing on that piece, but then also the mantra of it's just another game. It's just another game. It's not the Masters championship. It's not my 50%, 50% of my grade 12 mark. That's going to be, it's just another test. It's just another game. It's just another.
Or even part of my process for development, right?
Oh yeah.
This is my way of improving, right?
That's
so
true.
Getting out of that fixed mindset a little bit. Yeah.
Actually, I do that with my auditions. It's funny.
Yeah.
I've never thought of that. It's just, this is part of my work. It's not to get the job. It's part of my work.
You're improving the product, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. So maybe let's go into choking, because I think that I love, talking about that. I actually do talk a lot about it with my kids, because a lot of them can, and especially my boys who play hockey, for example, they can, they've had those moments where they just, they've got the final game shot and they choke. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So it's a common one, right? And definitely related to that anxiety. But we think with choking, what tends to happen is, again, the body starts to feel anxious. Usually it's as a function, right, of being in that performance situation with higher consequences. Mm-hmm. That's where we see it happen the most, right? The game's on the line, or it's an important game in the tournament. Nervous system goes up. And as soon as the mind and kind of body recognize that going up, it starts to sometimes appraise that as a bit of a threat, right? This doesn't feel good, or it can impact my performance in a negative way. And then what we think happens is attention goes again from the outside and execution of the tasks I need to be doing, which I do need to be doing kind of in the here and now, right? Mm-hmm. I've been practicing it for, and it goes inward into threats, right? So my attention is no longer on the game, which makes it harder for me to perform, and the skill I want to be doing. It's focusing internally, which increases my nervous system activation and my anxiety even more, which makes in sports, especially, or let's say it makes it physiologically more difficult to activate things, right? If part of that consequence is that I have muscle tension and kind of this bracing activity where my muscles are tightening against each other and my heart rate's up and my focus isn't able to execute as well, then I'm less likely to perform. And we think that's part of that choking behavior that we see, right? So then they go and rush the shot and they miss it. Right. Or they're not able to as fluidly kind of execute that mechanic as they would be 1,000 other times when they practice it, because all those forces are in play.
Right. And I've read too that sometimes it's because we overfocus. And so, that implicit memory isn't working great anymore because we are focusing too much. So for example, if, like, we know how to ride a bike, we don't have to, when we're first learning to ride a bike, we have to think about balancing and how do I steer my handlebars and pedal. And we're thinking of every single action that we're doing. And it's hard, right? That it's coordinated movement. But once we have it, we never have to think about it again. We never have to think where our hands go on the handlebars, where our butt goes on the seat. But when we over focus and we're so stressed out and we're so worried that we're going to fall, now all of a sudden it's like we're a beginner again. We've lost all of those automatic skills that were so implicit because we're focusing on too much. So like we're over focusing again. I don't know if that's something you work on as well.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And that's what we think is, and it does depend on the performer in the situation, right? Like you said, in skill acquisition, we do want people more explicitly focusing on those mechanics. But once it is an implicit kind of skill, like you said, overthinking or over focusing on all the details of what I need to be executing actually takes me out of my ability to do it as well, right? Because that's not the nature of the skill in that moment. Right. So it's a really good point. And it's something that we have to be aware of too, as we're working with performers, is their relative skill level and ability. Because it does influence a little bit about what we have them focus on and how much.
I remember watching a video of a girl, she was a ski jumper. And so she had always done the little ski jump. And this was her first, she had a ProGo camera on her helmet. Yeah. And she was moving up to like the 60-foot jump from the 20 to the 60, whatever it was. And so you can hear her really starting to panic just as she's about to go. This is so big, right? And so all her coach said, it's just another 20. It's just a bigger 20. It's just a bigger 20. And so you could hear the girl, she was still nervous, but it's kind of like that. I got this. I don't have to think about where my feet are and how I hold my body and how much do I have to squat and how much do I have to tuck and, all of those things. So that's what this girl started repeating to herself. I mean, she couldn't have been much more than, 14 to 16 at most. Like, I don't even think she was that old, but she was saying, it's just a bigger 20, it's just a bigger 20. And you could still hear the nervousness, but you could also hear the confidence growing. And she first went and you could hear the panic rising, the fear, but then about halfway down, you could tell she's like, I got this. She didn't actually say it, but you could just tell because now she started cheering and she did it and landed it. And it was, big party. So that's sort of like, I'm prepared. I've got this. I've done this before. And so that's why I can see that connection, highlighting it back to those strengths and the times that I've done can become so powerful in the moment.
Yeah. So again, when I hear that, I'm reducing the size of the threat or challenge here, right? It's just another 20.
Right.
So I'm reducing that. And I'm also kind of, subtly kind of reminding myself that I do have the strengths and resources before. I've hit 20s. I've hit these other things. I can do this. And that can kind of sneak in there for sure. Another piece around that appraisal I didn't touch on that's also really important, though, is how we're having athletes and performers appraise the anxiety process itself. So that's another area that sometimes we include in those mental routines, but also is an important one to address. We think, if a performer is noticing that they're feeling anxious and they kind of view it as, oh no, there's anxiety, that's a problem, that's a threat, we think performance is less likely to be as good as it could be, right, and go down. But if we can have what we call kind of an adaptive appraisal or helpful appraisal of anxiety, this is my body's way of helping me to get ready to perform. There's an ideal level of this I needed to be able to execute, even if it doesn't feel great, then we think that can help with performance. So it's a really also sometimes important component that sneaks in there sometimes.
And I think that that's important. I mean, one of the very first pieces that I do with parents and kids and teachers and whoever I'm working with is the normalization. This is normal. Our brain is built to be anxious. It's protecting us. So that being like, thank you, anxiety, for watching out for me, making me know that this is important. So I think that normalization piece is absolutely huge because it's so easy to think, what's wrong with me? Everybody else is happy. Everybody else can do it. Why me? Right. And then that just worsens everything.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I do have one more question just about some of your sports stuff, but anything around this topic that we haven't talked about that you think is important?
Yeah. I mean, not so much. I think we gotten to some of the stuff that's most important to me when I work with youth and adults. The only other thing that I didn't mention too that relates to sports, but also back to kind of life is I think sports can also be used as a nice vehicle for working and learning to experience anxiety that we can generalize to other contexts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes when we work with people, like we work in an office like this and we see them on a couch or in chairs and people understand that. And sometimes they have some of the skills there, but we don't totally, I think it's hard to really have those skills in depth absent the context to really learn them, right? So we want an environmental context or a situational context where my body is responding really powerfully when there does feel like there's something on the line. So I think something that's important to consider in this area overall is, yeah, some of these can also be used as a really nice vehicle where we're going to get some of those powerful emotions and body sensations and challenges. And if we can use that to help us to really test and practice and build those skills, then we've got them, right? And we can use them in a range of other circumstances. So that's something I also kind of like to have for athletes that I work with, is also just remembering it can go back the other way, right? We can really use this as a vehicle sometimes.
I think that was right along the lines of what I was going to ask, because I know that you train and coach in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you had mentioned, sports can be used as vehicles to promote that mental toughness and resilience.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's what I was going to ask you about. And it sounds like you beat me to it.
Well, I'm passionate about that one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that sport. And I think, combat sports in particular sometimes have a bit of a extra edge in terms of activating the body and some of those safety systems. So they can be good ones, especially if we know intellectually that they're generally safe.
Right.
And I see it all the time with youth, and even more so with adults. It's interesting because I think the adults that I see and coming into their very first classes have almost even more kind of activation of those body responses than some of the kiddos do, right? Because kiddos are sometimes used to some of those nerves that come in a little bit more, but adults, we haven't felt that in a while sometimes. And so they're coming in and they're like, whoa, my body's getting activated. This is my first class. You see them kind of really, their breathing's changes and they're exhausted immediately. They're very kind of focused on not doing anything wrong or some of these other processes. So to me, that's just an excellent example of, hey, here's a really nice area where we can kind of generate some of that and hopefully help people. And inevitably that's what happens, right? As they get through that and they become successful and their body sees, hey, I did this. Hey, it wasn't a huge threat. Hopefully, hey, it was fun as well. Then again, I see some of those more durable skills and abilities kind of come for working with that stress and anxiety.
Yeah. I actually have a friend who does jiu-jitsu, and he had a shoulder injury a couple of months ago, and he can't do anything right now. And it's so hard. And you can just see his mental health deteriorating. Right. So I think that there's the physical component, but I'm always saying sports is a huge protector factor. We've got our teachers, we've got parents, we've got important people in our life, but sports, I would say, is like just as important, because there's belonging, there's connection, we're working together. There's being able to manage disappointment when we do lose, right? Like, I think that there's so many pieces there that help build that emotion regulate, even wrestling with our siblings. I tell parents, let the kids wrestle, because they're learning that emotion regulation and self-regulation and, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, exactly. Social components, ego components, lots of important areas that can kind of get activated in that.
Yeah, exactly. And with that sports piece, well, it's just going back to the analogy that I often use is how to train your dragon. So just how you were saying, when being on our couch doing the work is one thing, we can talk about it, but when we're comfortable, nothing's going to change. It's just like How to Train Your Dragon in the movie, right? Hiccup and his friends have to go wake up the dragons. They have to put themselves in a dangerous situation to be able to train that dragon. And so in this case, our amygdala, our emotional brain, to train it, we have to activate it. So yeah, that was a great point. Wonderful. I mean, we could probably talk for hours and hours on this, but I think that gives a really good overview. And I think so many different professionals and parents and people listening can take it to their own unique context and really apply it. So wonderful.
Well, I think it is a good lens, right? And something to consider, especially for some of the youth that may not always be therapy inclined, right? Or they may feel a little bit like, if I'm going to therapy, there's a problem. I see a
Right.
fair amount of that too, right? Of youth coming in because that orientation of approaching it as improving performance is a little bit easier for them to kind of connect with, right? Or feels a little bit less stigmatizing in some way. Not that it should be, but for them, it can help to have that. So just a consideration too out there for parents or who have youth that are kind of on the fence maybe about the therapy, but still, are fundamentally looking at some of these performance situations of the anxiety showing up. Sometimes it's a fair lens.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I often talk about too, like I love seeing kids when things are going good so we can keep that going. What is going good? Let's bring that awareness to it so we can keep that going, right? It doesn't have to be, crisis. That's usually what we see, right? Couples counseling, it's usually when couples are at the end of their marriage, right? Or seeing kids when they've had a panic attack and they had to go to the hospital. So, being proactive around all of this can be good too.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. I've got your contact information. I will put that in the show notes for people if they want to get in touch. And I see that you've left a couple of resources there for everyone as well. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Yeah, it was good to see you again. Thanks for having me on.